the voice of resistance, on the legitimacy of Amhara struggle and the prosecution of Ethiopia's soul. My name is Abebe, an Ethiopian by birth, a seeker of peace by conviction, and a son of a people whose existence is now caught between extinction and resistance. I do not speak from theory of abstraction. I speak from the depth of a national wound that has festered into a moral crisis. I write to testify, not merely to recount what is happening to the Amhara people and the Orthodox Christian faithful, but to reclaim the truth which this government seeks to erase, not just with bullets and bombs, but with silence. What we face in Ethiopia is not a political misunderstanding or a dispute over policy. It is a systematic erasure of people's right to exist. The Amhara are not merely being marginalized, they are being hunted, bombed, raped, displaced, and starved by a regime that deploys National Defense Force not to protect, but to prosecute. It is an onslaught of annihilation conducted with chilling precision. Federal, regional, and special forces sweeping through towns and villages, raiding homes, public executing young men, humiliating women, desecrating churches, and targeting the elderly who dare stand in dignity. When the world hears Fano, money rush to judge without context. But Fano is not a political party, nor a calculated insurgency. It's a cry for survival from the forgotten margins of collapsing state. It is a resistance born from not of ideology, but of necessity. It is the instinct of a people whose backs have been pushed so hard against the wall that stand up become their only path forward. Critics suggest that Fano lacks a manifesto, an organization, a coherent political structure. But what does a piece of paper mean when your churches are burned, your sisters defiled, your sons abducted? What manifesto is needed to justify the primal right to defend one's life when your government has become your executioner? Others argue that the struggle is illegitimate because it seeks to dismantle a domestically elected government. Yet, democracy, in its essence, is not a ritual of ballots. It is the legitimacy of consent, the dignity of the governed, and the justice of laws applied equally when the government becomes the predator. The people's right to resist becomes not rebellion, but restoration of moral order. A vote cast under fear, propaganda, and censorship is not a mandate. It is a mask over tyranny. The real question is not whether the Amhara resistance is lawful. The real question is how can one justify obedience to a regime whose very foundation is the subjugation of millions? In the face of calculated extermination, resistance becomes not a matter of politics. It becomes the deepest expression of human dignity. In philosophical terms, we find strong grounding for this struggle in thinkers like John Locke, who declared that when a government betrays its function as protector of rights, people have the right, even the obligation, to revolt. The state, Locke said, is not a divine master, but a contract. When it breaks its promise, the citizens are released from obedience. The Amhara resistance fulfills this logic, not with theory, but with blood and tears. Thomas Hobbes, often misunderstood as advocate for absolute power, warned that when life becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, people are justified in rejecting their sovereign. The Ethiopian state has, in its cruelty, reinforced, reintroduced that condition for the Amhara, displacing order with fear, peace with perpetual violence. Even Anna Ardet, writing The Shadow of Totalitarianism, reminds us that power is not violence. Power lies in legitimacy. When a regime uses force not to protect but to punish identity, then its violence is no longer power, it is decay. But the resistance is not only about survival, it's also about memory, about history. The Amhara people are heirs to civilization, to a moral tradition, and to a faith that has endured for centuries. It is not merely bullets that threaten them. It is a coordinated cultural erasure, targeting everything they represent. Churches are torched not by accident, but as a symbolic execution of civilization. Priests are slain not because they fight with arms, but because they fight with prayers. It is a spiritual war against Ethiopia's soul, not just its citizens. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church stands at the heart of this cultural survival. It is not just a religion, it is a historical anchor, a philosophical compass, and a moral guardian. Today, it is under siege, not just by physical assault, but by ideological infiltration. The state not only turns a blind eye to church burnings, it often facilitates them through omission or covert collaboration with extremist proxies. In recent years, new instruments of destruction have appeared. Wahhabist actors imported to destabilize, evangelical prosperity gospel proponents imported to dilute, and even government-manipulated religious factions built to divide. The attack on Orthodox Christians goes beyond Amhara identity. It is a broader assault on Ethiopia's spiritual backbone. To be an Orthodox Christian today is to be a target, regardless of ethnicity. But the fact that most of the faithful also happen to be Amhara only sharpens the blade against them. It is both the religious and ethnic cleansing disguised under political pretexts. What is especially alarming is the state's subtle use of modern tools, including AI surveillance, digital IDs, and internet shutdowns to silence resistance, prevent documentation, and suppress communication. In a nation already bleeding, the regime weaponizes technology to deepen the wound. It is no longer merely military oppression, it is algorithmic erasure. Still, despite the savagery of the onslaught, the resistance endures. The young men and women of Amhara, armed with outdated rifles, traditional blades, or nothing at all, take the hills, caves, and forests, not to wage conquest, but to protect life. They are not soldiers trained for war. They are sons and daughters trained by grief. They do not march for ideology. They flee for survival and ambush only to return dignity to their dead. Even within this chaos, the spirit of community and sacrifice glows like an amber in ash. Families share food with fugitives. Elders pass wisdom under moonlight. Fighters carry the wounded for miles with no promise of victory, only the hope of not being forgotten. What critics fail to see is that this resistance is not born of hate. It is born of betrayal. The Amhara do not seek to conquer Ethiopia. They seek to be allowed to live in it. Their ambition is not to dominate. It is to exist without persecution. Their fight is not against diversity, but against the politicization of identity that turns brothers into enemies. There are many other groups who have taken up arms against the regime, each with their own motives. But the tragedy is that ethnic federalism, as designed in Ethiopia, has turned the idea of common resistance into fragmentation. The state thrives on division, keeping Fano from the Ola, separating Tigrayans from Amharas, pushing communities into suspicion and retaliation. The dream of an unified opposition remains distant, not because it is impossible, but because it is sabotaged from within. Still, hope must not be abandoned. The resistance must mature, not only in arms, but in vision. It must begin to sketch the outlines of just Ethiopia, not in manifestos dictated by elites, but in values drawn from experience, dignity, equality, harmony. The Orthodox Church in this regard can be the bridge if it rises to its higher calling. It can offer not just prayers, but moral direction. It must become the heart of reconciliation, the voice of justice, and the sanctuary of truth. And even in the midst of fire and blood, we must remember resistance is not the enemy of peace, and defiance is. Silence is not neutrality, it is complicity. Every time a priest is killed, a church burned, a mother weeps over her son's corpses, it is a call not just to fight, but to wake. The world must not understand. The elites may scoff, but history always begins with those who refuse to vanish. And in this land, beneath the scars and ash, there still beats the pulse of a people who refuse to bow. The Ethiopian state's most devastating betrayal lies not merely in its guns and bombs, but in the moral invasion it has engineered. It has inverted victims and aggressor, justice and crime, truth and propaganda. The regime has perfected the art of weaponizing language, branding resistance as extremism, labeling self-defense as terrorism, and rebranding genocide as law enforcement operations. Even international organizations, starved of honest data and paralyzed by geopolitical interests, often echo these false narratives, failing to see the bones buried beneath the regime's rhetoric. The world needs to understand the violence against the Amhara is not incidental. It is structural. It is embedded in a system that rewards ethnic supremacy, that glorifies provincial militancy, and that centralizes impunity. Federalism in Ethiopia is not a decentralized governance tool. It has become a warlord compact. It grants regional elites their own militias, their own borders, their own media, their own courts, each turning into a freedom of repression. And when the Amhara question this order, they are met not with dialogue, but drone strikes. The architecture of ethnic federalism has institutionalized resentment. The land question is not merely about boundaries, it is about identity, memory, and belonging. The very idea of being Amhara has been politicized to the point of criminality. Amhara presence in a region like Benishangul Gumuz, Oromia, or Southern Nation is formed as settler colonization, inviting mass expulsions, executions, and land confiscations. Generations of coexistence are erased with a decree. Children are orphaned with state-sanctioned indifference. But perhaps nothing is more heartbreaking than the war on faith. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the spiritual lifeblood of millions, is now seen by the regime not as a unifying institution, but as a threat to its ideological control. Churches burning are not isolated events. They are coordinated cultural warfare. The government may not always light the match, but it provides the conditions for the flame to spread. Impunity, silence, and calculated indifference. More sinister is the regime's co-option strategy. By infiltrating church leadership, promoting regional schism, and nurturing para-Orthodox factions loyal to political agendas, it seeks to hollow the church from within. The goal is not only to kill the faithful, but to deform the faith. It is a total war, a spiritual, psychological, institutional. To make matters worse, new foreign ideological infiltrations are accelerating the decay. The rise of Wahhabism and radical evangelism, often funded and backed by powerful Gulf and Western networks, is not accidental. It is part of a broader realignment that seeks to rewrite Ethiopia's moral and theological DNA. The age-old harmony between Orthodox Christians and Sufi Muslims is being replaced by imported religious supremacies that promote confrontation, not coexistence. These ideologies carry not only theological tensions, but also political motives. Prosperity gospel adherents, often linked with US-backed institutions, preach a theology of greed and individualism that alienates the poor and mocks the suffering. They reduce complex social agony into a lack of faith, deny structural injustice. Meanwhile, Wahhabist imams preach a vision of Islam alien to Ethiopian traditions, importing sectarian conflict and hostility towards Orthodox heritage. The spiritual ecosystem is being poisoned from both flanks, while the state orchestrates the chaos with silence or secret nodes. Even more dangerous is the manipulation of inter-religious discourse to incite open conflict. In recent months, scholars from the Orthodox community have begun to challenge the content of the Quran, not in malice, but in honest intellectual inquiry. Yet the government reaction has not been to foster dialogue or scholarly debate. It has been to criminalize the questioner. In a healthy society, theological discussion refines truth. In Ethiopia today, truth tellers are silenced because truth is feared more than violence. When Orthodox voices speak of justice, they are accused of sectarian incitement. When they defend their martyrs, they are accused of religious radicalism. But when foreign-backed extremists insult centuries of Ethiopian theology, they are protected as expression of freedom. The state has built a morality in reverse, where treason is rewarded and pity is punished. Yes, even in the darkest The resilience of the faithful is awe-inspiring. I have seen mothers risk their lives to retrieve desecrated icons from burned churches. I have seen monks walk barefoot across scorched fields to give last rites to children gunned down by state forces. I have seen teenage boys clutch both the Bible and the rifle, not to make war, but to preserve what's sacred. This is not a religious fanaticism. They wear the cross on their neck. It is moral clarity. It is a generation refusing to forget who they are, even when their identity is being hunted. When they fall, they still have their cross on their neck. Sad to see. To be Amhara today is to carry the burden of all these layers of persecution. It is to wake up to a world where every headline distorts your reality. Every government action treats you as disposable, and every path to justice is barricaded by bureaucratic complexity. The only crime many Amhara have committed is refusing to vanish. Their very existence disrupts the regime's narrative, and for that they are marked. It is essential to remember that this resistance is not directed against other atrocities or religions. The true enemy is not the Oromo, the Tigrayan, the Somali, or the Southern peoples. It is a system that has trained them to see each other as threats rather than kin. The same system that persecutes Amhara today will persecute others tomorrow. The struggle for Amhara dignity is ultimately the struggle for national redemption. That is why we must never reduce the resistance to mere tribal rebellion. It is civilizational defense. It is the last stand against a state that no longer defends its citizens. A plea for the rebirth of an Ethiopian rooted not on division but in justice. To the intellectuals who remain silent, to the spiritual leaders who compromise truth for favor, to the media who whitewash horror with neutrality, I ask, what will your silence buy you when the fire reaches your doorsteps? What will your comfort mean when history asks you where you stood? This is not just a political moment, it's an existential reckoning. Will we, as a people, remember who we are? Or will we allow ourselves to be rewritten by power-hungry cowards with bloody hands and golden tongues? To those outside Ethiopia who still have a conscience, to not look away. Your aid money builds the prisons where we are tortured. Your technology fuels the surveillance that silences our voice. Your embassies protect the killers and dismisses the victims. You may not pull the trigger, but you lubricate the machine. What we ask is not charity, but truth. Not pity, but solidarity. Not lectures, but listening. The Amhara people do not need sympathy. They need acknowledgement. Their blood is real. Their grief is raw. And their resistance is righteous. If the international community cannot offer justice, it must at least stop protecting the unjust. If it cannot heal Ethiopia, it must stop breaking it further. Let us now consider the future not in the abstract, but in the urgency of what must be done. If this moment of resistance is to become more than a desperate city, it must evolve into a moral awakening. Fano, in its raw and fragmented form, carries the seeds of a new social contract. Though it is decentralized and often disorganized, it is not aimless. It is rooted in instinctive self-preservation, but it also contains within it the possibility of ethical reconstruction. Indeed, Fano's struggle transcends immediate warfare. It holds the potential to reimagine the Ethiopian polity itself. This is not a call for mere regime change. It's a call for the burial of a degenerate political order that has been forsaken the people and rebirths of an Ethiopian, not based on bloodline, ethnicity, or clientelist networks, but on a virtue, merit, and shared history. And Ethiopia must begin where the old one fell, at the altar of truth, acknowledging the genocide against Amhara, the desecration of the Orthodox Church, the displacement of millions, and the betrayal of intellectuals and foreign allies alike must become the cornerstone of any post-conflict discourse. Healing does not begin with forgiveness. It begins with naming the wound. The silence surrounding these atrocities is not neutrality, it is collaboration with evil. In such a vision, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church must reclaim its rightful place, not as a political actor, but as the ethical conscience of the nation. Its burnings must be remembered not merely as crimes against a religion, but as attacks on the nation's soul. The sacred texts, the monastic traditions, the liturgies in gaze, and the spiritual disciplines passed through millennia, they are not merely rituals. They are the civilizational spine of Ethiopia. To sever that spine is to collapse the body. And what of the youth? The young Amhara generation, traumatized, hunted, radicalized, must not be abandoned to grief and rage alone. They are not cannon fodder for future battles. They are the architect of renewal. But for that to happen, there must be education, organization, and vision. The current silence of universities, the absence of philosophical forums, and the targeting of independent thinkers is a strategy of intellectual sterilization. It must be countered by underground schools of thought, by digital libraries, by philosophical resistance. We must teach them that resistance is not only about arms, but also about ideals. That freedom is not merely the absence of oppression, but the presence of dignity, justice, and moral order. That even in warfare, there must be ethical codes, that Fano must not imitate the state it opposes, but transcend it in virtue. That their ancestors did not merely fight invaders, they built kingdoms of culture, faith, and hospitality. The same must be said about Amhara elders and clergy. They are not relics of the past. They are keepers of memory. Their wisdom must be preserved before it is lost in the fog of war and displacement. Oral traditions, ancient chants, chronicles, and poetry must be compiled, digitalized, and passed to the next generation. A nation that forges its story cannot write its future. And yes, even the digital space must be reclaimed, not as a playground of disinformation, but as a battlefield of truth. The AI surveillance system deployed by the government, the internet shutdowns, the digital profiling of dissenters, their These are tools of modern repression, but they can be countered by encrypted communication, digital archiving of testimonies, blockchain-based truth records, and diaspora-based media cells that amplify the silenced voices. While the government uses AI for oppression, we must envision a counter-AI, an ethics-powered technology that gathers oral testimonies, maps atrocities, links dispersed communities, and facilitates decentralized collaboration. Not a tool of control, but a guardian of memory. Not a weapon of the state, but a servant of the people. Let us also be brutally honest. The current struggle may last years, even decades. There may not be a clear political victory on the horizon, but not all victories are political. Some victories are moral. Some are generational. Some are unseen in headlines, but echoed in eternity. The survival of the Amhara spirit, dignified, faithful, unbending, is itself a victory over tyranny. When the war is over, and yes, it will be over, what will remain? It will not be the place of tyrant. It will not be the propaganda speeches. It will not be the AI surveillance towers. What will remain are the graves of martyrs, the echo of prayers sung under gunfire, and the stories of men and women who refuse to kneel. That is a legacy we must protect. And so, in conclusion, this essay is not merely a defense of a people. It is a summons to consciousness. It is a reminder that what is happening in Ethiopia is not localized conflict. It is a test of what the human spirit can endure and what it must never accept. It is a warning to the world that ethnic tyranny, when left unchecked, becomes a devourer of nations. It is a message to history that the Amhara people do not perish in silence. They roared. And if there is any justice left in this world, their roar will be heard, not just by their enemies, but by the future itself. Written in moral witness, in solidarity, and with unwavering hope by myself, Abebe, founder of Ethiopian Hearts for Peace, a voice for the voiceless, a servant of truth. Thank you.